Scott Lukas is professor of anthropology and sociology at Lake Tahoe Community College in California. He also taught anthropology and sociology at Valparaiso University in Indiana. Scott received his doctorate from Rice University in anthropology, his master's degree from the University of Iowa, and his bachelor's degree from Indiana University in anthropology. The recipient of the McGraw-Hill Award for Excellence in Undergraduate Teaching of Anthropology by the American Anthropological Association, the California Hayward Award for Excellence in Education, a Sierra Arts Foundation Artist Grant Program Award in Literary Professional, and the Lake Tahoe Community College Distinguished Faculty Member Award, he was a nominee to the California Community College Board of Governors. Amongst others, he has published or edited 3 books on theme parks already. The Immersive World's Handbook, 2012, Theme Park in 2008, which also appeared in Arabic translation in 2013, and The Theme Space, Locating Culture, Nature, and Self in 2007. And you can find all of these books on our book table right outside. And if this was not enough, Scott is also planning, as most of you happen to know, to edit a reader in themed and immersive spaces, which is scheduled for publication in 2015. He appeared in the documentary The Nature of Existence and has provided interviews for, to the best of our knowledge, the Huffington Post UK, the Daily Beast, the Washington Post, and Caravan. Incidentally, as Filippo already mentioned, this is not Scott's first time to Germany or his first time to the University of Mainz. In summer 2013, Scott spent 6 weeks at our institution as a guest professor of the Mainz Center for Intercultural Studies, teaching students and giving guest lectures. We wanted him back, and he's agreed to come back, and to talk about The Theme Park is Dead, Long Live the Theme Park tonight. So please join me in welcoming Scott Lukas.
So I begin today with this moment of transformation. The theme park, in its historical protoform in Coney Island, is witnessed doing what it can only replicate in simulated forms of apocalypse, of the likes of natural disaster, rides, firefighting spectacles, and end-of-the-world morality plays. Yet here it burns multiple times, in iterations of Steeplechase Park, Luna Park, and Dreamland in the famous Hell Gate fire. While we might at first view these images of the burning down of the theme park's protoform as a sort of death, we might also instead see its flames through a lens of ascension, a sacred order in which the end of one form gives life to another. As we witness these historic images today, we see familiar faces in those ruins, variety entertainment taking place within a controlled space delimited by a berm, rides and technologies that immerse, alter, and excite bodies and minds, recreated places, cultures, and people, presented as spectacle and entertainment, and in some cases as pedagogy. As we look at these familiar sights, we also recognize new manifestations. The theme park, now a fully branded and hyper-corporate form, spread across the globe throughout many nations and cultures, supported by multiple technologies and media modes that challenge for supremacy among all other entertainment and consumer forms, fully integrated in cities and other spaces as a dynamic and controversial architectural and design approach, and extending itself through theming and other forms in places that include museums, workplaces, homes, even hospitals. As researchers and designers, we might ask today, what new life will present itself on these foundations of the theme park? And in what other ways will we witness the theme park's demise? Today, I will focus on 3 key areas that each in some way illustrates moments in the life and death of the theme park. These include meaning, the imaginary, and criticism. And I hope that each will express not some truth of the theme park, but a mere trace of it. My hope is to stimulate more thought and debate about an object I will show that is often viewed through very commonsensical and unexamined filters. I've chosen the polarity of life and death as a way of putting into words my own struggles with the ambivalence surrounding my discontent with some of the critical views of the theme park and some of the perspective of those within the industry unable or unwilling to address such criticism. I also choose this approach to emphasize my own liminality within this field of study, which has included often competing work as a former Six Flags trainer, an academic who studies and teaches about theme parks and theme spaces, and a sometimes consultant to the theme park and theme space industry. As well, my focus illustrates my unease about the future trajectories of the theme park, particularly the transformations of this architectural and cultural form into new realms. Where appropriate, I emphasize a number of key actors within the field of theme parks: the social critic, the patron or guest, the designer, and the operator or worker. These are not the only actors within this field, but these are the ones that I feel provide opportunities for provocations and dramatic illustrations of the theme park. From time to time, I will include discussion of spaces that appear to be outside of the theme park field, but I hope to use these spaces to emphasize the idea that new life is being given to the theme park in the manners of its rhizomatic expansion into the world. Let me begin with this focus on meaning. I choose meaning not only for the intent, or having in mind that meaning suggests, but also for the etymology of lament, sorrow, and mourning that is implied. I will suggest 9 specific meanings of the theme park today that will likely illustrate both the intent and lament of this cultural form. But let me first mention a basic definition of the theme park, which, however unnecessary, gives us a sense of the initial ground on which we stand. Most dictionary definitions of the theme park speak of it as an amusement area whose structures, narratives, contexts, settings, buildings, and activities are based on one or more central ideas or themes. In Disneyland's original form, the main theme lands included Main Street USA, Adventureland, Frontierland, Fantasyland, and Tomorrowland. Other theme parks like Angus Wynn's Six Flags Over Texas included similar theme lands that were focused on more literal spaces such as Mexico, Spain, and France. The sense of narrative, connectivity, and organicism that theming provides is perhaps the key factor in differentiating theme parks from amusement parks. Let me now shift to these 9 specific meanings of the theme park that I wish to muse upon. I begin with personal meaning, as it reflects a different understanding of the theme park that most greatly contrasts with the meanings attributed by social critics. This is the realm of experience that consists in how patrons or guests interact with the places, people, things, and events within theme parks, and it also includes the direct quotidian reality of theme park workers whose primary job is to satisfy the desires of guests. In terms of guests who visit theme parks, we note a curious contrast of the meanings they attribute to these sites, often centering on pleasure, enjoyment, excitement, senses of magic, and the like, and the meanings provided by critics. In Umberto Eco's Reflections on Disneyland and Travels in Hyperreality, we detect a direct challenge to guests' emic or insiders' understandings of the park. And this is one of the many instances of a critic who argues that guests who enjoy theme parks display a certain form of false consciousness. This sentiment is also echoed by Tom Carson, writing in LA Weekly. In Carson's mind, the meanings of Disneyland are given to the guests in a non-negotiable sense. As I will struggle with throughout this talk today, I would say that Echo and Carson do have valid points in terms of their identification of hegemony, conformity, and other culture industry issues that are associated with Disney and all theme parks. At the same time, I offer that numerous researchers of popular culture have pointed to the ways in which supposedly passive consumers do display agency and enact their own meanings, even in the face of massive corporate, branded, and consumerist power. As one example, we may look at the global phenomenon of fan fiction and fan art, particularly that which involves characters from the Star Trek universe. We might agree that the specific example of Kirk Spock / fiction and art is a major departure from the foundational meanings of Gene Roddenberry, Paramount, and its writers. As Henry Jenkins has noted in his work on convergence in fan culture, we see new developments in the world of popular culture that suggest that passive consumers have a much more vital role to play in the world of media and pop culture meanings. I would also argue that fans, including theme park fans, provide the theme park and other media forms with a sense of new life as they bring new meanings into being. as Derrida and Gadamer would have us understand, with the idea of the never-ending play of signification in the world. We should also note that we have seen larger-scale forms of resistance that have taken place inside theme parks, which themselves result in direct alterations of the park's meanings, both in the instance of resistance and in later hermeneutical reflections upon it. The most spectacular of these was the Yippies' assault on Disneyland and Tom Sawyer Island in 1970. In 2006, the artist Banksy used the setting of Disneyland to address the plight of prisoners in Guantanamo Bay. As I'll return to later with the film Escape from Tomorrow, one could argue that the ubiquitous corporate meanings of theme parks provide an interesting ground on which resistance may take place and in which new meanings may emerge. A related phenomenon in terms of new meanings of theme parks is the growth of alternative guidebooks that project a much different side of these spaces. In this case of Leonard Kinsey's book, an emphasis on sex, drugs, and rock and roll suggests new readings of classic theme parks and their intended experiential components. There was also an interesting subculture of Disney guests who drop acid, smoke pot, or otherwise further subvert the intended meanings of the parks. The sum of these various counter-meanings of the theme park suggests the possibility of alternative narratives of an industry that is often known for protection of its intellectual, technological, and cultural properties. Again, we see new life on the part of actors external to the design and operational meanings of these spaces, which may appear to be quite deadly to other actors. In terms of personal meanings, it is also worth noting that a side of the theme park industry that is rarely considered among critics and journalists is the world of the employee. My experiences as a trainer at Six Flags Astroworld in Houston, Texas, often contrasted with my anthropological analyses of Astroworld and the theme park industry that encompassed my dissertation research. Day-to-day operations in the park reflected the dynamics of work and interaction that are common to many service industry workplaces and that have been analyzed by Arlie Hochschild, Nicholas Rose, and in the many offshoots of the work of Irving Goffman. I share some of these materials with you here today and suggest that while much of the narratives and the discourse that we communicate to employees focus on the dynamics of being on stage, playing roles, acting on performance in line with theming in the park, the day-to-day ethnographic expressions of Astroworld, at least through my eyes, often centered on issues and circumstances that one would encounter in many places of work. Who's sleeping with whom, who just got fired, someone is mad at the boss, numerous war stories about angry and unreasonable guests, fights with coworkers, and so on. As cliched as it does sound, the real life of a theme park may be found in those everyday moments of worker improvisation, thinking on one's feet, dealing with adversity, and managing the tricky dynamics of social interaction. As I related with these theme park worker memories, a good deal of the work experience of those in theme parks centers on the inherent sociality of the workplace. We may reflect back on the early years of Coney Island and its proto-parks to get a sense of how significant this meaning is. Affordable and varied entertainment was available at Steeplechase Park, Dreamland, and Luna Park, as well as along the beaches. Many historians who have studied the parks have written of the democratic appeal that Coney Island offered. Not only was it affordable, but it allowed people to mix and mingle in ways that they had never before. Rides like the human roulette wheel literally threw strangers together, while attractions like the Blowhole Theater blurred the lines of spectator and performer, guest and worker. This gregariousness of Coney Island cannot be understated as one of the foundations that could provide incredible sustenance to the contemporary theme park. As we jump back to the present and consider the social nature of theme parks today, we may see some startling tendencies. In the United States, we see a growing circumstance throughout popular culture in which media and entertainment has an individualistic or at most family-centric orientation. Sociologist Robert Putnam discusses this tendency in his work Bowling Alone. In terms of theme parks, I believe that there is a danger of the social meaning of amusements noted in Coney Island losing its potential life-giving. Consider as one example Disney's famous Haunted Mansion ride. The ride is arguably one of the great rides in history, yet metaphorically, when we look at the ride itself and how socially isolating its vehicles are, we might reflect on whether or not other guests and their experiences really matter when one visits a theme park. Thus, I believe it may be worth asking, to what extent do contemporary theme parks promote sociality that focuses on, mimicking Coney theme parks or amusement parks, this value of diverse social interactions? An important arena of future theme park ride and attraction design may be to consider the greater possibility of rooting such designs in this world of sociality. As a future research, I mentioned the latest Royal Caribbean cruise ship, Quantum of the Seas. The ship will integrate social and mobile media, among other elements like virtual interior cabin walls, RFID technology, robotic bartenders, and a satellite beaming its signal directly to the ship. The sum of which suggests a new emphasis on life space or an integrated approach in which the patron's world, and particularly its social components, is interfaced with the experiences of the cruise ship. The textual meaning is one that I found particularly interesting as it provides a perspective on the theme park that I would say is somewhat skewed or focused through an alternative lens. The immersive potentials of video games make their world an apt one in which we see the recreation of the architecture, technologies, and accoutrements of theme parks. The earliest versions of these games, Theme Park World, Sim Theme Park, and many, many others, focus on the organizational dynamics of attending to guests, and in a few cases, even focus on labor dynamics and negotiations. The Roller Coaster Tycoon series emphasized the thrill of building one's own roller coaster and highlighted the public's fascination with theme park ride engineering that is reflected in numerous publications, specials on cable television, and with groups like ACE, the American Coaster Enthusiasts. Contemporary games like Theme Park continue to focus on work and structural dynamics, though notably do emphasize the theming of the parks. The most current game, which is the crowd-funded Theme Park Studio, offers the most extensive focus on theming and park architecture and allows gamers to create sophisticated and detailed theme park landscapes. These textual meanings of theme parks in the world of video games are paralleled by many of those in the world of film. Final Destination 3 uses the terror of a roller coaster that can kill, as do Thrill, with its great punchline, "You ride, you die," and Roller Coaster. We also find the dystopic films Westworld and Future World, whose theme park robots run amok and kill patrons in the first film, and in the second are used in the plot to clone world leaders. The most significant of recent theme park films, I believe, is the 2013 movie Escape from Tomorrow. The film is interesting for its take on a father who travels with his wife and kids to the Magic Kingdom and eventually has a breakdown, lusts after French teens, and grows increasingly tired with his familial commitments. But what is most curious is that director Randy Moore and his crew of actors shot the film secretly at Disneyland and Walt Disney World, unbeknownst to Disney officials. Indeed, this guerrilla filmmaking is quite remarkable for the fact that it occurred in such protected and highly guarded spaces as the Disney theme parks. As I have discovered in my own research to Disney spaces, it's quite easy to get yourself noticed by Disney security while filming on their properties. Go back to the film. What is surprising about Escape from Tomorrow is that Disney did not pursue legal action against the filmmakers. Some have said that this is due to a lack of an intellectual property infringement claim. Perhaps, though, Disney realizes, not unlike Prada in this Prada ad that acknowledges the illegal trade in Prada knockoffs, that the film only extends their brand, an interesting moment of brand death providing unexpected life. Interestingly, there is an entry for the film that appears in the official online Disney A to Z guide. In a number of my writings, I have suggested the curious tension that exists between the theme park and its erased or forbidden themes like violence, social and civil unrest, and death. What many of these filmic versions of theme parks convey is a sense of connection to this forbidden realm, to unheard of or underrepresented topics, and an existential meaning that I will address shortly. Of course, we should also note the synergistic and transmedia potentials that films, theme parks, and other media share. The success of the Wizarding World of Harry Potter at Universal in Orlando has proven this synergy. Currently, there are plans for a Hunger Games theme park and an Avatar land for Disney's Animal Kingdom, and thus it seems that such opportunities for trans and cross-promotion will continue.
A number of novels have used the setting of a theme or amusement park as their foundations. Robert Stewart Nathan's Amusement Park and Lincoln Child's Utopia rely on the tropes of disorder and terrorism, while Richard Stark uses an amusement park as the grounds on which feuding mobsters battle it out. A series of young adult books, like Disneyland Hostage, continue the themes of crime and terrorism in theme parks, while Mitch Albom's Sentimental, The Five People You Meet in Heaven, follows the life of an amusement park worker to relate religious parables. Fortunately, to combat Albom's text, we have the more alternative work of Nicholson Baker's House of Holes, which is set in a sexual theme park, and Karen Russell's Swamplandia, in an alligator wrestling theme park. Perhaps the most interesting on this list are Stanley Elkin's The Magic Kingdom, which gives us an existential take on the theme park via the lives of terminally ill children, and Julian Barnes' romp England, England, which involves the creation of a theme park that authentically represents the entirety of English culture and which gives us the most telling fictional text on the topic of the nature of simulation and representation within the world of theme parks. What is also telling about Barnes's text, along with the many other texts of theme parks that I have related, is the extent to which it necessitates a debate about what the ultimate effect of the textualization of theme parks means for the theme park. Does this textualization create new life for theme parks? What can we say about textualization and its relationship to industry, brand, and corporate meanings? The meaning of the theme park that we may attribute to its industry, branded, and corporate foundations is particularly significant. For critics, certain parks or parent companies are synonymous with the form itself. Indeed, it is difficult to challenge this meaning, as the most successful theme parks are owned by some of the most successful corporations in the world. We may review some of the park rankings here. Reviewing Disney's industry holdings, which are quite difficult to fit on one page, we note relationships between multiple media and entertainment forms. Disney has been quite adept at leveraging these relationships in synergistic and transmedia senses. There is more life here as the theme park expands its own form and that of the corporation, which, as critics point out, results in cultural, economic, political, and existential death for the rest of us. In addition to the fact of synergy and transmedia being wrapped up in the meanings of theme parks, we should also acknowledge the important issue of the branded nature of theme parks. Walking into most theme parks in the world, you cannot help but notice a brand or two or 50 as you observe park attractions and rides. I was especially reminded of this while visiting Blackpool Pleasure Beach many years ago. There was an uncomfortable juxtaposition of some of the park's historic markers and murals with the many contemporary brands that served as meeting points for guests or for sponsorship of rides. Some nostalgic side in me would like to think that there is still a place in this world for family-run, non-branded theme and amusement parks like Knoebels and Kennywood in Pennsylvania. These parks, and even Blackpool with its creeping branded space, maintain a different meaning of the theme park, and I believe that guests experience such spaces in entirely different ways as compared to branded theme parks. We should also recall that even in cases when it appears as if a space is not explicitly branded, it may still be branded. Naomi Klein reminds us of this in her analyses of Celebration, the former Disney theme park offshoot, as Community, and we should also be on the lookout for the opposite, the completely branded space that celebrates the idea of more fully experiencing a brand in a quasi-theme park atmosphere, such as at BMW World. The theme park as a branded and corporate meaning has also impacted how theme parks, to personify a bit, look at themselves. A resonant aspect of Disney and its theme parks has been its protection of exactly what Disney and Disney theme parks mean. As I related earlier, the Escape from Tomorrow film is an interesting moment in the evolution of the Disney theme park, primarily because Disney did not pursue legal action against the filmmakers. There have been many instances in which Disney has taken swift action against those who perpetuate wrongs against its brand. Consider the mouse orgy controversy that occurred at Disneyland Paris when costume characters simulated sexual acts while in costume. When a video taken by a cast member made its rounds on the internet, Disney was not exactly excited about this example of brand expansion. We should also be aware of the ways in which the branded and corporate meanings of theme parks have impacted their criticism. Politicians, social critics, and bloggers have expanded the meaning of theme parks such that the application of the word theme park has political and critical efficacy, as in this context of the war in Iraq. Bryman's Disneyization of society is an example of a critical deployment of the name of the theme park as a branded hegemonic force, while many others have spoken of the idea of the theme parkization of the world, which leads to the important and related cultural meanings of theme parks. I believe that there are two broad senses in which we may speak of the cultural meaning of the theme park. The first alludes to Bryman's work and the notion of theme parkization, namely, that theme parks more and more are impacting culture. Bryman's Disneyization owes much to George Ritzer's work, The McDonaldization of Society, in which Ritzer described the principles by which McDonald's has come to impact the world outside of McDonald's. In the case of Disneyization and theme parkization, we find the idea that theme parks are dominating non-theme park arenas. Education becomes more focused on entertainment and immersion, less on substance. Museums gear themselves towards edutainment as they see themselves in direct competition with theme parks for the public's attention. And numerous other consumer spaces, like casinos and restaurants, orient their design and operations in accord with principles of theming. The second and related area, in a chicken and egg sort of sense, is the meaning that theme parks are adapting and changing in line with culture. One of many examples is this instance of a social media kiosk at the theme space New York, New York in Las Vegas. Both of these are clearly significant aspects of what the theme park means. I should state that in terms of the first meaning of Disneyization and theme parkization, it may be important to develop new analytical and research approaches that better identify the modes, processes, semiotic channels, and specific instances in which theme park modalities impact the day-to-day operations of traditionally non-theme park spheres of life. The related political meaning of theme parks is worth noting as well. Here, I refer to the meanings of theme parks that interface with the world of politics, racial, gendered, social class, environmental, and other forms. One of the most current examples of the interfacing of theme parks and politics is the SeaWorld Blackfish controversy. Blackfish is a 2013 documentary directed by Gabriella Copperthwaite that details the controversies related to the SeaWorld's park use of killer whales. The film raises many issues about the environmental ethics of the captivity, training, and use and performance of killer whales. Indeed, the effects of the film have been so widespread that some have heralded it as the beginning of the end, the death of SeaWorld. SeaWorld has responded rather vociferously and has claimed that the film is nothing more than propaganda, going so far as to produce a point-by-point refutation of every minute of the film. What I find curious about this meaning is the fact of the direct engagement of the theme park in the realm of the political, and the fact that the meaning of the theme park shifts the consciousness of many SeaWorld patrons or potential patrons from the sign of entertainment to the sign of political and environmental responsibility. As we know, Disney theme parks have been in the center of their own political controversies. Over a year ago, I spoke here in Mainz on the historical and political controversies related to Disney's failed efforts to build Disney's America in the 1990s. The space would have been a Civil War-era theme park, and this fact alone, along with its geographical proximity to Civil War battlefields, led to divisive discussion, a U.S. Senate hearing, and many editorials and public debates about the project. As this cartoon lampoons, many felt that a serious historical topic like the Civil War should not be left to a theme park. I am likely in the minority in believing that the park should have been built. As I have suggested in previous work on theme parks and social justice, theme parks have had a history of awkwardness, if not silence, when it comes to addressing the realm of the political within their spaces. The changes to the Kali River Rapids and Kilimanjaro Safari's rise at Disney's Animal Kingdom from an explicit to implicit political message is one case in point. Typically, critics have viewed the museum or interpretive center as the only venues in which explicitly political or dark touristic messages may be conveyed. This view, I believe, rests on an over-politicization of the theme park and an under-politicization of the museum in terms of the politics of representation. At the same time, the view rests on a traditionalist notion of politics that should be challenged by more contemporary views of the political that perhaps leverage the worlds of consumerism and spectacle in various ways. Duncombe's Dreampolitik and Hart and Negri's Empire among the many examples. This controversy as to whether serious and political topics can and should be considered in a theme park leads to the important critical meaning. I will save this discussion for the third section, but it is important to identify that some aspects of this meaning represent a justification of the idea of the death of the theme park. For many critics, the theme park connotes consumerism, escapism, superficiality, conformity, and many other negative associations that I have summarized in this word cloud. Let me say that while I agree with most of these criticisms, I take exception to the specific framing of such critique, namely to the lack of actionable meso-level, practice-oriented outcomes of such critique. But let me put this on hold for the moment. My dissertation on Astroworld and American theme parks was titled Signal 3. This referred to a radio code that went out in the park in the case of a serious injury, most typically a death. As someone who operated the park's radio on many occasions, this was a code that I dreaded having to call out. I never had to do so, but unfortunately, after my employment with Astroworld ended, one of my close training colleagues did have to call out a Signal 3, which she relates in an email. As my dissertation reflections began to emerge, I noted that the work began to take on a rather existentialist tone. I worked with an artist who created a number of works that reflected this tone. My role as a theme park trainer, my work as an ethnographer. Here, the ethnographer is depicted among calamities occurring in the park, and in other cases, training activities gone wrong are represented. Here, a decayed box of training papers that we had to sort through in reference to a ride lawsuit in the park. In others, the surreal scene of ill-fated pumpkinhead dancers and an employee affectionately known as Vomit Boy for his propensity to vomit on rides during employee-only after-hours parties. In connection with this art and the work of Georges Bataille, my writing attempted to posit an existential meaning for the theme park. Among the vomit, seedy behind-the-scenes events, accidents, lawsuits, employee emotional breakdowns, even death, I asked the question, how does the theme park explain us, our being, and we, it? For now, I will leave this meeting with other questions that reference work that I have conducted on theme parks and the question of authenticity. The final meaning of the theme park relates to its linguistic, semiotic, and symbolic foundations. It is my belief that a number of the other meanings that I have addressed, notably the personal, textual, cultural, political, and especially critical, have their origins in the ways in which theme parks create meaning through forms of architecture, design, material culture, technology, performance, and many other forms. Let me address these directly in the next section on the imaginary. For now, I will suggest the summary of these 9 meanings of the theme park. Keep in mind that this is a thought picture, and in many cases we could debate the extent to which one or more of these meanings give life or death to the theme park. Again, it is my hope to use these as a way of stimulating more conversations about the nature of the theme park and its many related and competing meanings. As I suggested in this last meaning, the theme park and its offshoots and theme spaces is quite thoroughly an entity that is dependent on various yet interconnected linguistic, semiotic, and symbolic forms. I want to focus on an amalgam of such forms, the imaginary, and use it as a device to suggest the apparent simplicity of the theme park's meaning systems, whether to the social critic, patron, or designer operator, is in fact something other. As we imagine the internal monologues of those who might be associated with the meanings of a theme space like Paris, Las Vegas, we see in each actor a sense of certainty. On the surface of the facade, symbols, performances, visual cues, and all other entities that compose this theme space, we each have the sense that the meaning provided is apparent. In some cases, such as the critic, we are desirous of another place, perhaps a more authentic or less consumerist one, that would combat what has been identified in the criticism of the theme space. Looking at it in a different way, a postmodernist might ask that we consider the combination of such meanings and even focus on those that are not present. One of the greatest challenges of studying the theme park and theme spaces is getting beyond the sense of the apparent as we, the observer, whatever our role might be, gaze upon it. Here, we forget that what is apparent is also apparition, concealing meanings from us. Let me suggest the idea of the imaginary, which I'm using here to refer to any form that is created or imagined, so to speak, without identifying for the moment any sense of the real or the authentic, and which forms the basis of a world or cosmology to which we and others orient ourselves. While the imaginary common to theme parks and theme spaces is multifaceted, it is important to focus on theming and its role in these spaces. Theming represents one of the most important, perhaps the most important, of technologies that has flowed from the theme park to other spaces, as suggested in the diagram. The use of a predominant theme, whether Western or tropical, place-based, or more figurative, is a common design and operational focus of restaurants, museums, and interpretive centers, casinos, lifestyle stores, and many other spaces around the world. Like other forms of the imaginary, theming is a mode of thinking, design tactic, aesthetic approach, and operational foundation that has governed much of the contemporary consumer landscape. It has almost equally divided critics and practitioners. Such differences illustrate much about the nature of representation common to theming, the semiotic and symbolic issues that I've mentioned earlier, as well as the politics of representation and what I will conclude with in the last section of my talk. To address both of these complications of this form of the imaginary, we may look at the Venetian in Las Vegas. The Venetian, like many of the other theme spaces on the Strip, relies on appropriation, remixing, admixture, and many other techniques in which essences are used to connote qualities, values, ideals, and concepts that are representative of the theme. Critics often scoff at the idea that one could represent the multiplicities of one place in a few key essences. Indeed, this is a worthwhile criticism to address, as highlighting certain essences may result in stereotyping, overdetermination, or other ills that reflect the tricky nature of what I refer to as culture sampling, or the ways in which people, events, places, material forms, and immaterial things are used and remixed to create a new form. What is especially fascinating to me is that the design process by which theming is conceptualized and materialized in theme parks and theme spaces. The architect Joel Bergman, responsible for the Paris Las Vegas, told me in an interview that Paris Las Vegas was more authentic as a result of research and trips to the French city, but at the same time stated that many paraphrases and some entirely made-up elements were used. In another case from the world of theme parks, I once interviewed an architect that when I asked him of the inspirations behind a new Iceland themeland for the park, gave me a very honest response. He offered that one of his initial source documents for capturing the essence of Iceland was a simple Google search, similar to the one I have pictured here. During the interview, he was very conscious of previous criticisms that have been leveled against theme park design projects, especially those of Disney, and offered to me that what he was doing had less to do with reality and more with stereotype. As I reflect on these two different approaches to theming, I wonder whether or not we have a legitimation crisis in terms of this version of the imaginary. Does the different sourcing matter, or are we left in the mind of the critic, following the only path down which theming may take us, into the worlds of simulation, consumerism, and conformity? In my conclusion, I will suggest that more attention to the relationship of the nature and methods of representation and the critiques of representation is needed. But I should now ask, how do we reconcile the gaps that exist today between the conceptual material instances and the critical political engagements of the imaginary? As I alluded to in the example of Paris and Venetian Las Vegas, theming reminds us of partiality. We know that only certain facades, specific moments, selected performances, heightened and allegorical symbols become the stuff of the theme space's landscape. Theming is not only a representation of other versions, it is a remixing of them. For just as certain facades, moments, and symbols are selected for the space, principles of composition, assemblage, and relationship are set forth in that space. As Jean Baudrillard notes, Disney's victory is not only in that it is interested in erasing the real by turning it into a three-dimensional virtual image with no depth, but it also seeks to erase time by synchronizing all the periods, all the cultures, in a single traveling motion, by juxtaposing them in a single scenario. The issue of this erasure of time, space, and culture into a singular moment, what I would highlight as the act of conflation, is, I believe, a key issue of concern to the designer, patron, and critic alike when each encounters theme spaces. Looking at one key instance of conflation that is a key concern of this conference, time and temporality, we see that the theme park is not unique in the ways in which time is mutated in its various designs, attractions, and performances. David Lowenthal, in his epic work The Past is a Foreign Country, emphasizes the main roles that the deployment of time in history in mutated forms serves. In his related and shorter work The Past is a Theme Park, he provokes us with a statement that identifies the theme park as a triumphal realm of faith, not of fact. History is causal, he also suggests, and the overall effect of the theme park is a jumbling of various times. Both the architects and the audiences lump it all together, co-mingling epics, disregarding calendars and context, and often resigning to senses of nostalgia and comfort in terms of the constructions of history. Lowenthal emphasizes that these modes of conflation and representation of the past are not limited to uses in theme parks. Museums, interpretive centers, and many other spaces are familiar sites in which such uses are also evident. In line with Lowenthal's analyses, it will be interesting to identify similar themes that may emerge during the course of this conference. At the same time, it may be important to address these conflations of time, and we should not forget culture as well, in such a way that we identify what the end results of them are. For example, we could say that in a given culture, that the particular telling of time and culture in themed and immersive spaces impacts the ability of citizens to learn important periods of history in that culture. Could we also say that the conflations of culture that we witness in such spaces impact the ability of people recognizing important political claims being made by others in terms of their specific indigenous or human rights concerns? Might these various conflations of time, space, and culture require us to rethink our assumptions about the linearity and strictness of time, the organicism of space, and the authenticity of culture? In any discussion of the theme park imaginary, I believe that it is important to address the field of Disney Imagineering. For those on opposite sides of the debate about theme parks and theme spaces, Imagineering represents a catch-all for both the celebration of the ascendancy of the theme park and for the criticism of its overwhelming impact on our cultural worlds. It represents a key locus for both practice and criticism. A portmanteau of engineering and imagination, Imagineering, at its core, suggests a bold strategy that may be brought to bear on just about any type of contemporary space. Not just theme parks, but cruise ships, lifestyle stores, and many other hybrid sorts of spaces. This word cloud reflects many of the terms that appear in the official Disney Imagineering texts, which range from overarching texts that cover the history of Disney theme park design and more specific manuals that focus on key design issues in specific theme parks. One of the more curious things that we discover in such texts is the extent to which Disney addresses the criticisms that have been leveled against its Imagineering practices and their design materializations in their theme parks. Here, in the case of Main Street USA, refutation of authenticity and an argument for memory, emotion, and artistic license. Here, the heavily loaded ideals of fantasy, romanticized expressions, exaggeration, charm, and the familiar. As well here, in a number of projects, again identifying with the ideal, emotions, and a non-adherence to historical accuracy. And, in this case from California Adventure, the ideas of homage, coalescence, composites, and less than exact representation. And finally, an argument made about the accuracy of plants used for storytelling purposes as opposed to environmental accuracy. I believe that all of these examples reflect the sense of Disney's growing awareness of the criticisms leveled against its practices, or I might say that they reflect more of an effort by Disney to justify practices that are not always justifiable. Of course, these are textual examples and reflect in so many ways an attention to public relations that Disney has been cognizant of for so many years, throughout its various products, spaces, and cultural consumer output. What can be said beyond texts, particularly in terms of the politics of Imagineering, as part of the theme park imaginary as it compares with the ideal practices of Imagineering? To close with this example of Imagineering and to segue to the related topic of criticism, I offer this diagram that reflects the curious connections that we witness in terms of the idea of the imaginary and that of creativity. Imagineering, we might say, is often heralded as the epitome of creativity, at least in terms of the corporate consumer world. In addressing these notions, either as practices or critiques, we commonly see assertions that may get us closer to a sense of understanding the difficult and embedded issues that are at play when we are discussing the legitimacy of theme park imaginaries and design approaches like Imagineering. Let me suggest the paralleling of the idea of the imaginary with the ideals of creativity in the hopes of extending the considerations of theme parks to other examples of a crisis of representation. To this end, we might recall the many debates that have occurred in the world of art and aesthetics, notably those of the post-1960s, and polarities like commercial art and authentic art, the artist who sells out and the creative artist, art as representation and enjoyment, and art as rebellion and subversion, among others. To another end, we might reflect on the crisis of representation that took root in anthropology in the late 1980s with works like Writing Culture and Anthropology as Cultural Critique, which suggested a need to look more closely at the politics of ethnographic fieldwork and writing. This example offers an interesting connection of these three arenas, looking more closely at the idea of the crisis of representation in a very distilled definition as a presumed inadequacy in the way in which an imaginary represents reality. We see that aesthetics, art criticism, ethnography, and the critique of ethnography share with the theme park and its criticism the curious yet vexing issue as to whether any imaginary can ever be said to be authentic. Let me conclude today with a third and final reflection on the theme park, that of criticism, and focus on 4 suggestions for the future. As I have examined in previous examples of the theme park's meaning and its relationship to a certain imaginary, the life-death axis of this cultural and consumer form rests in large part on its relationship to criticism. There have been multiple critiques that have been applied to the theme park form. I have listed a number of them here, but perhaps I have left a few out as well. Again, I should reiterate the value of such critiques and at the same time express some concerns about the nature of their use. Greil Marcus, in his piece 40 Years of Overstatement, Criticism in the Disney Theme Parks, notes that Disney criticism, like the parks themselves, reflects overstatements, exaggerations, and emotional assertions. While Marcus is onto something here in terms of the direction that some theme park criticism has taken, he is surprisingly vague in terms of what alternatives might be imagined in a post-theme park or post-theme park criticism world. This is an area that we can and should address. So, let me offer 2 thoughts on the nature of theme park criticism that could be areas of future growth and intrigue. First, we might look at the possibility of reconciling the differences in meanings that are reflected between the theme park as envisioned by the critic and the theme park as understood by the designer, worker, patron. This would necessarily be a challenging reformulation that likely rests on a jettisoning of the absolutist Platonic forces that have dominated this and other forms of media and pop culture criticism in favor of more contingent Nietzschean forces that could do much to promote more darkness and shine less light on the theme park. Second, as I've alluded to earlier, we might address the intent of the criticism of the theme park. Here, I am thinking of the inspirations of meso-level, feminist, and aesthetic-based methodologies, which not only suggest the importance of stating the intent of one's research or criticism, and of situating the critic-researcher in terms of that individual's positionality and relationship to the object of study, but of enunciating the desired result, state change, or transformation envisioned by the critic or research. As one example of this last area, we recall that in Durkheim's study of the dynamics of social integration in society and related issues like anomie, he addressed the value of praxis, such as the implementation of occupational associations, as a means of dealing with such social issues. A more contemporary example is found in critiques of social media like Facebook and the fact that theoretical studies of the social problems associated with social media have resulted in practice-based ideas to reduce the effects of teen bullying, peer pressure, and other associated negativities of social media. There is no problem, I think, with the argument that the theme park should die, provided that one state which social structures, pedagogical reforms, organizational arrangements, or architectural and spatial projects be advocated for in its wake. A third concern that parallels the examples of the art world and ethnography in the last section is the issue of the divide or incommensurability that we observe between actors involved in a field but appearing to be on opposite sides or extremes of it. I am reminded of a provocation that I offered in a talk that I gave at the Theme Entertainment Association SATE conference. At the time, I suggested, at least metaphorically, of the idea of creating a confessional space in which actors on different sides of the theme park imaginary might be able to first express their concerns and then experience redress such that their concerns be heard. Somehow, after all the actors, the critics, patrons, operators, and designers have had their say, there would be an opportunity to build upon these enunciations in a discursive space that would be polyvocal in spite of the apparent agon or conflict among the actors. At the time of my original statement, I was thinking of this as a conceptual argument. I am now of the opinion that high time it is to imagine practical ways that such conversations could be had. The method of Delphi and the design or architectural charrette come to mind as two approaches that purport to bring together various stakeholders for dialogue within a field and around an object of mutual concern. Would it be possible for such a practical undertaking to occur within the field of theme parks and theme spaces that would include the various stakeholders or actors that I've been considering, or am I trapped in my own theme park of optimism and idealism? This leads me to a fourth and final concern, which is likely the most idealistic and unlikely of them all. Addressing the nature of fieldwork and research in topologist George Marcus suggests the importance of complicity as an apt trope for the contemporary ethnographer. The previous methodological, epistemological, and indeed moral orders of the past, in which researcher and subject were distinct, existing in their separate imaginaries, has come to pass. I would extend Marcus's notion of ethnographic complicity beyond method and argue for a more philosophical or existential proposition in which we come to understand that while we are all, as designers, critics, researchers, workers, and patrons, participants in the theme park imaginary, we have not envisioned a way for all of us to collectively engage this imaginary and our own unique versioning of it. Complicity also reminds of the middle voice, that voice not present in English, which is between the active and the passive, neither subject nor object, and which is conceptually a part of the world, not above it or between others in it. For me, both complicity and the middle voice remind the possibility of a new theme park imaginary, one created as communities of scholars, critics, researchers, designers, and all others, play off of initial tensions that reflect our disconnections, only to later realize new visions, theories, and practices of the theme park that are co-evolved. We look to the future of the theme park through its past, whether through Walter Benjamin's Angel of History, blown into the present, or in this cave with its versions etched in stone. Thank you.